So good evening, everybody. My name's Dave Berman. I know most of you. I'm the township manager, and we're here this evening to hear from Michael Baker International about the alternatives analysis that they performed for the Wynnefield Drive flood mitigation study. Tonight we have, of course, Commissioner Larry Holmes. We have Art, I'm going to get it wrong, Vavernia. How's that?
You got it right.
With Michael Baker International, we have Tamara Mittman from Michael Baker International as well. And I see Amy Cuthbertson, our Finance Director and Assistant Township Manager. I also see, I don't know if he'll be participating, but I see Chuck Faulkner from Pinoni on the call. And I see probably 12.5, give or take, residents, mostly Wynnefield Drive. And, Art, I set this up so you could share your screen, and I hope it works. And I'm going to let you lead the presentation. And I'm assuming you'll want to reserve all questions for the end, but you tell us.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. I'm good either way. We could, if I'm in the middle of something and somebody has a question, feel free to chime in. I know there's a raise hand button on the screen, but just assume that I won't be paying attention to that. So if you could just if you just want to start speaking or say something quick, that'll work.
I'll pay attention as well, Art, to help you out.
Okay, thanks, Steve. All right, let me share the screen. Is everyone able to see my screen?
Yes.
Yeah.
Great. All right. Okay. Well, again, thanks everyone. I see some familiar names and faces. This is starting to be the last meeting in our contracted scope of work with Haverford Township, and we're here to really wrap up our study, present the results, and take questions, discussion, and see where do we go from here. Okay, so just a little background on the steps that we took in the study, the timeline. We kicked off back in April 2021 with a meeting like this one, just sort of introducing ourselves and giving a plan as to what we were going to do at the time. And at the time, we had a scope of work that included identifying 10 possible alternatives that could solve or reduce the flooding at Wynnefield Drive. We prepared a memo/report. We presented that at a meeting in July 2021 to give everyone an update. We presented 10 alternatives, some of which were they were broken down into the quote-unquote non-structural and the structural options. The non-structural options are the ones that sort of protect the home or residence property against flooding. Structural alternatives would be the ones that we're here to talk about tonight. Sort of the larger scale capital projects that would be, financed by the township or others, and projects that take up some amount of space. So we held a meeting, and it was really based on the feedback we got at the meeting when we presented the 10 alternatives, which alternatives we were going to select for the detailed study. And somewhere around that time in late 2021, maybe early 2022, as Dave and the township were in contact with FEMA and PEMA on the grant that they applied for and told that they would receive, the township learned that the PEMA and FEMA would only be to reimburse parts of the study that happened after the grant got executed with the township. So in the best interest of putting together an efficient study, we put everything on pause. And when the township finally was able to get the grants executed, that was May of last year, we held another meeting with this group here, with the community, to give everyone an update what we were about to do. And we're here at task 5, the last part of the process. So the purpose of tonight's meeting is to review the alternatives analysis that we conducted. We're going to get a little bit into the process that it took, as well as the findings. We're going to talk about some strategies for mitigating or reducing the effects of flooding along Wynnefield Drive in the study area. and we're here to take your questions and your comments. So to start us off, process of the study. So those structural flood mitigation options that we identified for further study in 2021 were the floodplain reconnection in Merwood Park. And that was the idea of digging out dirt from the park to lower the playing field surface, to give floodwater a place for temporary storage rather than to occupy there, rather than, hopefully not enter people's homes. And we wanted to see what effect that would have on the elevations. Along with that, we looked at what would happen if we had just raised the existing berm in Merwood Park. And the third option was the underground storage in Merwood Park, which is basically the similar concept to digging out all the dirt, except this would build the playing field surface back up to its present elevation, and any of the infrastructure, ball fields, backstops that would be removed, taken down, would get rebuilt to their original locations. So there was a fourth option that was in play at the time, and that had to do with the idea of digging out the material in the floodplain next to the septic tracts. So Michael Baker and Haverford Township held a meeting with SEPTA in late 2023. We presented the idea, and it was a non-starter. It was a no-go. SEPTA did not want to allow more frequent flooding onto their property. They have operations and service that they have to prioritize, and that's just something that they could not take on. So we disqualified that option as of a couple months ago. But the real goal here was, in defining the scope of this study, we really focused on what the township could accomplish on township-owned land that was upstream of or directly adjacent to or next to Wynnefield Drive in the neighborhood. So first, the idea of the floodplain reconnection. What this graphic has shown you is land contours. So and the color shading represents, I think the red areas would be Hathaway Drive and the bus lane. This gray area are these septic tracts. Those are all higher in elevation than the park and the ball field here. We're not seeing any of the features from the aerial photos. So it's just like a way to communicate what the land's doing here. And you can see the channel here down bottom using the light green and the yellow. Some of those are the lower elevation areas. So if this is a snapshot of existing, and by the way, you can sort of see the berm here. In the proposed conditions, we propose to lower the floodplain of the park surface by about a foot. What this meant in terms of what would happen was, it was a 2,300 cubic yard excavation volume. And what that means is about 230 dump trucks would be needed to haul this material out, enough to fill about almost 3/4 of an Olympic-sized swimming pool. As for the berm raising option, this is the same type of representation. You can see the existing berm is a little bit taller towards the railroad end. In the proposed conditions, we looked at two scenarios, and they were really raising that berm to match the 100-year flood elevation per the FEMA maps. And another option was considered, that being add an additional foot on top of that. So the underground storage option in Merwood Park, some of you might remember the alternatives that we presented. And the underground storage, there's a few different types of variants for this type of system. But this photo here on the left shows you really pretty close to the system we were thinking. It's not the same manufacturer, but it's a system of these precast concrete vaults that be stacked and arranged together to create this sort of underground reservoir of space. Without getting into too much detail, there was a limit on how tall we could make or propose to make this system, and it was about 3 feet. And the reason for that is the existing stream banks are only about 3 feet high in most places next to the ball field. And going deep, that's because the groundwater level is always going to be, when you're standing in the creek, the creek water is, say, at your ankles. either to either your left or your right, that line really extends into the ground, and that sort of defines the groundwater level. As you might imagine, you can't simply create more space by digging out a deeper hole, because all that space down below is just going to be filled with water the whole time. And just to go back to the rationale of the floodplain lowering, there was limits on that as well. It's not shown here, but when the creek sort of passes under the bus lanes, there's some retaining walls that extend from that area and towards to the east of the park. So we assumed we couldn't touch those retaining walls, and we assumed that we couldn't touch anything on the sort of downstream receiving end next to the property here. Why do we lower it by a foot? Well, we wanted to. It was sort of a tricky process, but really we wanted to lower it to some point that we thought we could provide a meaningful amount of volume of temporary flood storage. But we didn't want to make it so low as to match, say, the bottom of the creek, because the lower the park surface is, the more often, the longer, the more often it'd be soggy and wet. So what all that meant was we did some statistical analysis to find out what flood event or what rain event would cause the creek to top its banks, and we set the edge of the floodplain here to that surface and sort of graded back at a slope, like a very mild slope, probably close to what's there today. And just here is an approximation of the footprint of the facility, just this pentagon shape here. Just to give folks an idea of what we're talking about here, that footprint in the park measured at 1.43 acres. And using that height of about 3 feet in the concrete vaults, that got us a storage volume of 4.29 acre feet, or about the amount of water that would fill 2 Olympic-sized swimming pools, about 1.4 million gallons. The storage was designed with a weir overflow that was sized to sort of take an incoming 100-year flood event for a certain area and pass through. And what we found was, through this analysis, that we could get an underground system here to manage the runoff from only 37 acres of the total drainage area of Cobbs Creek. That's over 1,200 acres. That only works out to about 3%. And on the right is just a graphic. When we talk about acre feet, the acre is a unit of measure that goes back to Imperial Britain, but it's an odd one. It's a tract of land 66 feet wide, 660 feet long, a foot deep. And those odd measurements were derived from surveying instruments from the time. So the basic steps of the study that we followed, there's 4 steps here. First, we had a topographic survey done of the stream channel, and that was important to get really accurate elevations on the channel and the bridges, footbridges, and roads structures that cross the creek. Next step was to prepare the concept grading plans, and this helped us understand how low we could grade Merwood Park down to. And then the final steps were this hydrologic analysis, which is really trying to estimate how much water is coming down each of the creeks that feed into the area, the Cobbs and the Pantreading Creek. And the hydraulic analysis is really taking those flow rates that you computed in step 3 and seeing, just what does that mean? What kind of water elevations, flood elevations are you getting through the site? So the storms that we studied were the 4 on the left here, and these are the typical storms that are modeled and studied when FEMA goes and does a detailed study of a creek like Cobbs. So that was the 10, 50, 100-year, and 500-year storms that they say the duration is 24 hours, but these rainfall amounts, which are, again, these are derived from statistics and rain gauges all throughout the area. These are constantly updated into a national database that NOAA, National Atmospheric and National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration, manages. And the 24-hour duration really is the bulk of this rainfall really falls in like the middle 1 hour or so of the 24 hours. And just for comparison, when we heard you folks and we found out when the major floods had occurred, we heard 2009, 2019, 2020 came up often. We just wanted to list 2011 here for Irene and Lee, which are pretty disruptive and damaging in our area. But just giving you an idea that all of these storms that created floods on Wynnefield Drive were less rainfall than the studied FEMA storms. So this table is just another way of looking at these, another way of thinking about storms. And what we say here is when the storm has a certain duration, these storms that actually happen on these dates, we found rainfall data from nearby stations, and we just sort of looked at it and saw when the main storm started, when it ended. So those are the durations you're looking at there, and none of those dated events are longer than 22 hours. But when you look at that sort of middle 1 hour of the 4 design storms down here that really have a lot of rain falling in a short amount of time, if you break that down to what the most intense 1 hour of the storm was, you get numbers for those design storms that are 3, 4, up to 7 inches per hour. That is a lot of water coming down in a very quick amount of time. But when we looked at the rain data for the dated storm events, these are actual recordings. So this would just be like, for example, in Irene, we saw 21 hours where a rain gauge measured rain, and the 1 hour that had the highest rainfall had 0.56, about half an inch rain, or sorry, it equated to about a half inch per hour. So again, what this tells you is the storms that FEMA is modeling, that we modeled, are more intense than a lot of the storms that have already flooded your neighborhood. Now we're just going to talk a bit about the peak flows, or the flow in the creek itself. And there is a stream gauge that the USGS runs, but it's down at City Line Ave where it crosses Cobb's Creek. You can't really use the data from that gauge for much other than to compare with the and again, these flood events, the flow rates would be at the stream gauge at City Line Ave, and these are all, the USGS computes these using long-term, they record this data, probably record stream flow every hour for, it's decades down there at the gauge at City Line Ave. So all this is saying is that the 2019 August flood was a little over 2,000 CFS, and where does that rank at that gauge is that puts us somewhere between a 10 and a 50-year recurrence interval. And I've probably said this a few times before, but I'll just reiterate that when we say a 10-year storm or a 100-year storm, all that means is in any given year, a 10-year storm has a 1 in 10 chance of happening that year, or a 10% chance of happening in any given year. A 100-year storm has a 1% chance of happening in any given year. You can have 200-year storms on back-to-back days, back-to-back weeks, or you may not see a 100-year storm for well over 100 years. That's just statistics here. Okay, so now to the study findings. I know a lot of you have downloaded the study. It seems I got a lot of email notifications that it was downloaded from our upload link. So you probably know the bottom line of what we're getting at here. But what we found was looking at the entire drainage area of Cobb's Creek upstream. That's 1,200 acres to Merwood Park. What was a little more surprising to me was that Pantreading Creek was over 700 acres where it joins Cobb's Creek. And you compare that to the available area in Merwood Park, which is only about 1.5 acres. So we have a lot of water coming down to an area that's flooding, and there's just not a lot of space for the types of practices that we had proposed. Just the kind of study we did, this H&H study, We really went for efficiency here. We really looked at this thing with the most efficient tools possible. That's a 1D hydraulic study using HEC-RADS. We didn't go out of our way to try to introduce any more complicated models into this. We just wanted to get to some answers as quickly, as efficiently as we could. So what we found was that fortunately, none of the options had really an effect or impact on the water elevations at Wynnefield Drive or at Merwood Park. The underground storage facility was the only one that actually decreased the flood elevations, but those were about an inch or so, and not enough to really make enough of a difference. And that underground storage facility, we worked with a vendor and we estimated the cost, and it came to $5.5 million. And maintenance costs annually would also have to take into effect just how you would have to go about cleaning the muck and debris and so forth out of that thing every time a storm happens. So, and I think what this really does is show you just how bad the problem is. To really make a difference at your site, you would need to put in about 33 of those underground detention systems that we size and work with the vendor to model. We need about 142 acre feet, and that works out to 46 million gallons, 66 Olympic-sized swimming pools. Or put it another way, you can see on the map here, if you were able to grade and excavate out Merriam Golf Club to become a flat basin and could fill it with about a little over a foot of water, that's what it would take to really help decrease flooding at Wynnefield Drive. So what can be done? I think it's worth revisiting some of the flood-proofing options that we had brought up in our study previously, and really, they are looking like the only means that we have that are cost-effective and viable ways to reduce the flood damage and the risk to flooding in the study area. Again, windows, doorways, basement doors. Some flood-proofing in areas you see actually people building up like small berms around, say like the basement windows that we see in front of some of your homes. And now Tamara's going to speak in here to this slide. She has some relevant news to report from other work that Michael Baker's done down in Alexandria, Virginia.
Yeah. Hi. So we were working with FEMA Region 3 on some mitigation. They call them mitigation coffee breaks. They're just like 1 hour kind of learning sessions. And the most recent one, there was a really interesting example that brought this case to mind from Alexandria. So the chief stormwater engineer from Alexandria talked about what was going on down there and talked about how since 2019 or so, they've just been seeing a totally different type of rainfall event, which they're calling cloudbursts. So they're getting like tons of rain dumped in a short period of time, and they're getting urban flooding. And a lot of residents are having their basements flooded. Sorry about that. And there's really nothing they can do to, stop these cloudbursts from happening. So they were working with the state to see what they can do to help residents like protect themselves from the flooding and make these events that are just going to happen just, less problematic for the residents. So Virginia, like Pennsylvania, is a Dillon's Rule state. So the city couldn't offer a type of grant without getting authorization from the state, but they did actually manage to pass legislation at the state level to have a stormwater utility that would provide fees that will go into this flood mitigation grant program. So they just rolled it out in the last couple of years. What they're doing is providing 50% grants that will cover 50% of the cost of eligible floodproofing measures. And there are about 20 eligible practices. They have a really nice brochure on their Flood Action Alexandria website that goes through all the different kind of systems that you could put in place for your doors, your windows, and your basement access points. And so far, it seems that the pilot program is able to meet a lot of the needs of the people who are applying. And it's just an interesting example, like a creative way to go about addressing this problem, which unfortunately they can't do anything about the the flooding itself, but they can do something about making the flooding less destructive for the people, for people's basements. So there's some links that we can share if people are interested, and can even share a recording of the webinar itself if anyone is interested in that. But it seemed like a useful example to share in this situation.
Great, thanks, Tamara. So just going back to some of the recommendations that we have after we finish the study, again, it's waterproofing, flood shields, flood barriers on the means of entry, like the garage doors, the windows, the basement entry doors, sump pumps, French drains in the interiors of the basements. I've got one in my home. I've had to put it in. Sealing those cracks in your foundation walls and slabs in the basement, waterproof coating on walls, possibly permanently sealing up those doors, putting in Bilco doors to replace your entry doors, and there's this topic of a basin-wide flood early warning system, and this is something that the Army Corps looked at many years ago for your site and others. In the absence of other measures that don't work, it's one of the ones that could work. So just wanted to find some options and examples of what we're talking about here. I was just able to find some of these Googling today, some of these things called a quick dam, something that apparently can sort of, I don't know, unfold and expand, sort of inflate to, says 3.5 inches high, and expands to 3.5 inches high in 10 minutes and can be stacked. And there's these other barriers that are just sort of to be placed in front of doors to fit them. We can provide this PowerPoint. There's an article in Popular Mechanics that has some of these, including, I think, the quick dam and this quick dam floodgate. But these are available for purchase in the U.S. I did find some that were overseas at first, but there are products out there. Well, just wanted legal disclaimer that we're not endorsing or sponsoring any of these particular products. Probably goes without saying, and now I just want to talk about some of the ideas or sort of, problem areas that we looked at earlier in the study, or potential solutions that we heard about from you folks, and just sort of closing the loop on some of these. So the idea, the flood walls or levees. At this site, levees are usually like earthen berms that are pretty wide in footprint. I think we had talked about flood walls, so that'd be something like you see here, more like the sound barriers that you see along the Blue Route. And these, these would really transform the way your neighborhood looks forever. And they also give sort of a false sense of security sometimes. So these would really look some way in your neighborhood. But that's a moot point because DP would not actually permit this. The sketch on the right is a map that the Army Corps had used, and we looked at it and we just sort of traced these features in color that they had looked at. But it's the same sort of thing where these flood walls would actually have to go in and line the creek all the way from Hathaway Lane to Eagle Road. On both sides, you would have to effectively like seal in the creek to the channel. But like I said, DP today would not permit this because, the township or DP would not permit this. The township has a floodplain ordinance that no development is allowed in the floodway or the floodplain. It's a standard type of ordinance that many communities across the country, like there's vast majority of communities in the country belong to the FEMA flood insurance program. And so as part of that, in order to offer flood insurance, the township has to enact an ordinance saying that they'll limit and restrict development in the floodplain. Now, Cobb's Creek behind Wynnefield Drive and in front of Merwood Park, this area you see in the red diagonal hatching, that means it's a FEMA regulatory floodway where most of the flow happens within that, and that generally lines up with the channel. But it's a zero rise ordinance. No, let me back up a second. You can't place fill in the floodplain without a permit. So you could get a permit to place some fill, say place it like raising the berm up, but you can't raise the flood elevations in the red diagonal floodway at all. It's not tolerable, which would happen here. Like this, I shudder to think how deep the flood would be inside the flood walls for a 100-year event. Meanwhile, everyone's dry on the outside, but it would be a kind of scary sight having all that water. And that's really goes to the reason why FEMA is not going to allow such a thing to be built. DEP, sorry. We had looked at the Carricung Swim Club back in 2021, and down there at the channel, this is the view looking from the swim club downstream, and that bridge you see there is Carricung Drive, I believe, or it might be an entrance road. I'm not actually sure. But this bridge, and there's this bridge a little bit upstream of the swim club. It's a septic track over top of it. We found that there were no obstructions in the channel that we could see. And we also looked at the FEMA flood study. And this is a profile that's sort of, imagine if you could look into the creek, say you're standing on the creek, standing on the bank, looking at the creek, and the water's flowing from the right to the left. This is just plotting the bottom of the creek channel is this bottommost line. And these, I don't know if you can see them here, but there's a few thicker black lines that almost look like the letter I, like this one here. That represents the bridge, the deck of the bridge over the creek. And the bottom of the I would be the lowest part of the beam, and the top would be the top of the parapet. So down here, Carricung Drive and its bridge are sort of shown way down here. The swim club is sitting about here, and the SEPTA bridge is this thing here. And if you were to completely block the SEPTA bridge or the Carricung Drive bridge, if either one, that would create this backwater effect that you can plot backwards or upstream. And if that thing was fully blocked, it would not affect your site because that water just projects backward. But here it's extended to the creek channel. In reality, oh, sorry, I may want to. These other lines you're looking at here above, remember the 4 FEMA study design storms, the 10 through 500 year? That's the model flood elevations that are given by these dash lines. The lowest one is the 10-year, and the 500 year is this top one. That's the solid black. And then on Eagle Road, we saw the photos and the video of intense storm, one of those floods that you guys experienced, and the water is just rushing down the curb line, and it flows right past this inlet. That's one of these older style inlets that we see in Philly. The opening is only like a couple inches tall. And this being a PennDOT road, this is not per their current specs. They would install something closer to this inlet, which is in Wynnefield Drive. So this thing would not be allowable today. But I just wanted to mention that it's true that water that's flowing down and bypassing this inlet and the others like it, we saw the evidence of it, the video where it flows into Wynnefield Drive and it makes all the flooding even worse. It's absolutely making it worse. But it's also true that if PennDOT were to completely revamp this drainage system and put in 4 of these newer style inlets, it's to replace the one and made the pipes all huge, and that there was never an issue of capacity of getting the water into the inlet and into the pipes and out to the creek downstream of Wynnefield. That still won't do anything to solve the flooding that's happening from all the rainwater coming down Cobbs, Pantreaty from upstream. And it's what's happening here is really like an example of what might be happening from when runoff is really rushing down Cherry Lane or some of the other roads in your neighborhood that are steep and they just all tie down into Wynnefield Drive. The flooding is being worsened by all that as well. So it's a stormwater management problem primarily, and it's that idea that this entire watershed of Cobbs and Penn Treading Creek, Haverford Township's in an area that was mainly built out almost 100 years ago, and stormwater and flood regulations just weren't in place today. And it's just a fact that the homes on Wynnefield Drive wouldn't be able to be built today under today's regulations, knowing what we know now. So hence, that's why we are coming back to the recommendation as well. We should look at flood proofing your homes. That's probably the one thing that you can do and should look into.
Art, can I ask a question?
Sure, Dave. Yes.
I didn't prep you for this, but what I can't understand is, even though you're saying there are no obstructions further downstream and all that, why does it flood here when there are no obstructions further down? That's what I can't gather. Why does it come over the banks here, but not when there's nothing blocking it further down? And I'm not an engineer, but I just can't figure that out.
Yeah. So here's what I'll say. Imagine we call them the flood profiles. So imagine this is the the surface of the water, the flowing water under a 10-year, a 50, 100, 500-year storm. The level that it gets in the creek is going to depend on things like how wide the creek is at any given spot, or like obstructions. And it's what this flood profile shows is that some of the smaller bridges in the park, not Eagle Road, because the biggest flood doesn't touch the bottom of it, but all the other floods, those bridges they're an obstruction, they're a restriction. But if you can imagine, pick any one of these 4 lines, these flood profiles, imagine at the upstream end, you've got a giant faucet turned all the way open, and it's flowing at a certain rate, certain GPM. That flood elevation is going to depend on, like I said, what the creek looks like in any spot. If those bridges are completely filled in, then you're gonna see something like, I guess there's not a good example of this one here, but it would overtop the bridge. So I guess what I'm trying to say here is the blue line here should really be trimmed right here at this, because for the 500-year storm, we know these are the elevations that it's going to hit on the way down, but it's just not going to project any further upstream. And the models that we put together, but we did a fairly simple model, but the models that FEMA puts together will figure this flood profile out more accurately. And it's not always just going to project back straight from the top of the bridge. In reality, you're going to have a little bridge, and it might not go back horizontal, it might go at a slope, but it's not gonna it's not gonna cause the flood water to jump by multiple feet the further upstream you get from the block bridge. I don't know if that was a little confusing, but
Art, it's Larry. Not that it was confusing, but I think you thought the question was about what could be done downstream to relieve the flooding upstream. And I think the question, though, is there something specific about Wynnefield Drive itself and the direction that all the water is coming down to Wynnefield Drive that makes it impossible to create enough outflow capacity to drain that as quickly as it can fill? I mean, that's if the channel were 100 feet wide instead of 8 feet wide, it would pour out faster, right?
Yes, that's right. But that depends on, but that only goes for as long as you can carry that 100-foot wide channel through. As soon as you get to a bridge, then it has an effect, and that projects upward.
Right. My question is, are there barriers, are there topographical barriers, are there physical barriers like the road, like the bridge on Eagle Road, that are insurmountable for us in terms of increasing the outflow in a high volume storm?
Yeah, there are, because to widen the creek to what it would take to help solve the flooding, you'd be impacting a lot of private properties, like a lot of backyards of homes, like downstream of Eagle Road, for example. But so it's really like, yes, you can widen the channel to bring the flood elevations down, but you've got to widen the channel all the way downstream to the mouth or very, very far away. And if you were to all of a sudden open up a wider section of channel, and then you run out of right of way and you can't do that widening anymore, and it has to narrow back, well, that's probably a case in which you make the flooding worse for those folks that live near that constriction.
So I'm sure you can understand that the folks on Wynnefield Drive don't feel all that good about being the flood prevention for the people that live downstream. And I don't say that to be funny. I say that it sounds to me like when you're dealing with a floodplain, such as Merwood Park, that floodplain in some ways exists for the purpose of being a way station for a shit ton of water during these storms.
It does. That is the function of the floodplain, is to let the floodwaters give it space to temporarily occupy and then drain down once the rain stops. That's right.
Sorry for the technical jargon, folks, but anyway. All right. Thanks, Art. I appreciate the response.
Sure.
I have a question about, I'm at 2415 Wynnefield. So I'm up near Eagle Road.
Yes.
So my question deals with Eagle Road and what we were talking about with the water coming down there.
Mm-hmm.
So I've lived here since 1982. And I don't want to sound like cold to my neighbors further down the street, but there didn't used to be the flooding problem up this end of the block that there is down further towards the park. I have no idea if it's because we're a little bit higher or if it's something else, but I can definitely say that ever since what we're talking about here, can't we get the state to at least fix that and maybe alleviate the problem for some residents? I mean, my neighbor across the driveway has his accounting office in the basement, and every time it rains, he's shoveling water out of his office. And that didn't happen when he moved in. So I understand. I mean, I totally get the cloudburst thing, because that's what it looks like to me whenever it rains now. My rain gauge will say we got 5 inches of rain in an afternoon, and yet that's not what you're going to hear on the weather. So maybe it just rains harder in certain places. I want to understand, I'm totally fine with maybe having to fill in my driveway or get rid of my garage, if that's what we all need to do to save the neighborhood. I mean, stop and figure, these are 100-year-old homes. They were built with garages at a time when people didn't own cars. So it's not like they were cheap homes. They were built for people who were moving out of the city. It's a nice neighborhood in a good area where I would have moved a long time ago. So how can we start to fix I mean, we can deal with floods when they come once or twice a year, but is there any way to, the stuff that can be fixed, can we fix some of it?
Well, we work with PennDOT, and we will, if the township desires, can look into, how can we more formally approach PennDOT about these issues, and we can report back.
I also saw the thing where SEPTA just said no, because they said that it's their right of way. Okay, well, all the property behind me that was taken by the township when my bridge washed away, I mean, there's a nice bit of property back there, and that brick wall is 5 feet high.
Mhm.
I mean, just to store some of the water someplace Can't, and that's not all SEPTA right away. Just take the big part of the yard that's behind, that used to be my backyard.
Joyce, that's on the other side, right?
Yes, it's on the other side, but it's in my deed. It does not
No, I
belong
get
to
it.
SEPTA.
No, I get it. Yours is probably one of the last that doesn't hit there, right?
Pardon me?
That yours is one of the last that owns that property on the other side, right?
Yeah, all of us from the corner in.
Yeah.
So I would probably say down as far as the Bernards, they own
Okay,
a little bit over there, but not as much as like 15 and 17 and 5.
I see.
Yeah, you live on one of the lots. Some of those lots, like you said, 4 or 5 or 6 of them, they're kind of bent, and there's a part that extends over. Your deeds do show some of that floodplain, the ground over there next to the Eagle Road Bridge. And what we were hoping to find is that, if we could prove that digging out a much greater amount of dirt from Merwood Park could have an effect, then it could be worth looking at that area some more. But I just have to say that digging out, if we were to only limit the digging out to the area on your deed and your neighbors, for the few of you, it really wouldn't make any difference. If taking Merwood Park down by a foot didn't do anything, it's just not gonna make it an effect that we can model, or that we could prove that there's a difference.
The difference to what? The whole street? Or I'm also trying, I know this is really going to sound selfish. I'm trying to understand if the whole street now has to deal with a problem that maybe dealing with a few properties would change.
No, it wouldn't have that kind of effect. See, there's just so much water coming down from upstream in the creek that you dig this dirt out, there's going to be more than enough water to fill that in as it's flowing downstream.
I don't doubt that for a minute, and I'm sure no engineer, but it would seem to me, just from the times I've stood on my deck and watched the creek flood, or looked out the bathroom window and looked at the water coming down the other side of Haverford Road and coming over the septic tracks and then trying to get into the creek, that if anything could be done to channel it further down and then open something up, whether it be the park, whether it be part of the property behind us, it's even if then you get a foot or 2 feet of water in your garage, it's better than 3 feet or 4 feet. Maybe it's not worth the investment. I have no idea, but the most I had 30 inches of water in the garage. I'm lucky to only have gotten a couple of inches in the basement. But I don't know. It just frustrates me when there doesn't seem to be a solution to even some improvements to a problem.
I get it.
I'm with you, Joyce.
Yeah.
I'm in total agreement with you, Joyce. I feel like the answer being there's nothing to do, instead of even just incremental improvements. And again, yeah, we're not engineers, but we've witnessed it, and the water coming over the wall, it doesn't seem like that much water. Like when it gets to the garage, it seems like a lot, but it just seems like there has to be something, even just to change it incrementally.
I get the frustration. I guess I'll say again, we were hoping that looking at the scale that we did, if that could show an improvement. And again, we're looking at the larger storms. It's unknown we don't know whether for a smaller storm, a cloudburst, a summer thunderstorm, that, it does make the water get high enough that it starts flooding. Maybe something like that. It could. There's just an unlimited amount of different, infinite combinations of how much water you get and how fast you get it in rain. That makes every flood different. Like no two rain storms, no floods are alike in that way.
One of the
Right,
major
and I mean-
problems is the 290s for the creek. It's not so much the water's held up from flowing because you're ramming the gallons of the creek into the wall at the corner of Cherry and Wynnefield Drive. That house right there on the corner, it's a 90, and then it comes back into a 90 where it ties into the other creek. It's slowing the whole flow of everything down because you're making a 90 as opposed to trimming it out and coming to a 45 and a 45 where you're not fighting the water. Like if you come and during one of the storms and look right at the peak, it is a shit show. It looks like you could start surfing with the waves that are forming from the water's crashing. It's a lack of being able to move that is more of a problem than necessarily the depth. Why would give you half as much more room for the water to go. To say that there's nothing that can be done is ridiculous.
This is Dave. I'm just trying to keep track of who's talking. Who agreed with Joyce? I couldn't get the name on that.
Megan.
That was Megan.
Megan, thank you.
2467.
And then we had Bernard. What's your first name again? I know we
Stephen, 2423.
Thanks. And then I just saw that there was a question that someone raised. Someone else had a question in the chat as well. Looks like Liz.
Yeah, hi, it's Ethan at 2424. So there are multiple tributaries to Cobb's Creek going out into Upper Darby and into Montgomery County, some of which are underground. Would it be possible to, for example, take a multi-pronged approach and address those maybe with that underground system? And if that was done at multiple places that fed into Cobb's Creek upstream, you could have a larger impact instead of focusing here where there's obviously a limited amount of space where one could do some sort of mitigation. If one did that in 5 or 10 places upstream so that less water was coming from all over 3 different townships and feeding into Cobb's Creek, such that, some of those nice green spaces and areas that benefit from the creek don't create this sort of impact in our neighborhood.
Yes, that's absolutely the type of thing that would work. If I did state or imply that nothing can be done, that's not what I'm here to say. There are things that can be done, and
that is what it sounded like. That is what it sounded like.
Okay, I apologize for that, but that's not the message here. In fact, no. If that's the type of effort that it would take, would be controlling runoff from the source, from development, from paved areas throughout the watershed. And it's much more effective to place these types of underground systems or above ground basins further upstream, closer to the source, not way downstream, where the site is in relation to all the rest of the watershed.
Because most of those tributaries are actually underground to begin with.
Yeah, where are the tributaries you're speaking of that are underground?
So, for example, like Naylor's Run and Upper Darby, Indian Creek that's coming from Montgomery County, that feeds into Cobb's Creek, etc. I mean, I don't know all of them, but all that water is coming from smaller waterways that are feeding into the creek underground, right? Because the visible origin of the creek isn't really that far away, but there's water feeding in from many areas into there.
Yeah, that's right. And I know some of those that you talked about. I know the Philly Water Department did some projects there. I think Indian Creek, where they opened up that buried tributary. Yeah, it was once an open, free-flowing creek. Somebody had just buried it decades ago for a number of reasons. But that's what they're doing more of these days is opening those up and getting the benefits of it.
I liked your idea of the dam where we divert the creek into the golf club.
No kidding. That would actually, it's the biggest tract of open space in the township by far. And again, the scope of our study was we were really looking at limiting ourselves to township-owned property, bigger tracts of land, adjacent to the neighborhood, adjacent to the park. There's not a whole lot out there, like the golf course. There's nothing like that that we really could see. But no, I've seen on some levels municipalities that neighbors to each other may decide to go in together and get the help of a county conservation district and DP and try and get funding for a bigger study that needs the cooperation of more than one municipality. And that kind of thing does happen. Here, if it were to happen here, I'm not sure exactly how something like that gets off the ground, but you can probably imagine that it probably starts with, folks like you and who are just, we're fed up with issues here. What can be done? Go to your local government about it. The county conservation districts, sometimes they have a really good idea of what else is going on in the watershed in the county and whether projects are eligible for funding or groups are getting together. So the kind of thing does happen. It just takes a lot of cooperation, a lot of time, and a lot of money, to be frank.
Art, when Joyce and Megan were talking earlier about whether or not you could expand the surface area of the creek at the at what I'll call, I guess, the eastern end of the channel, that's an issue. Still runs into the issue of we are at a certain capacity for outflow. Now, the slide you still have up on the screen here is that, I know for a fact, having seen it in the I forget which storm it was. It wasn't the 020, but one of the large inlets that's right where Cherry comes down had collapsed. The road underneath it had collapsed. I think there's serious stormwater issues along Wynnefield and then under Eagle. Cleaning those things out or replacing these, this old drain with just the non-porous top and just any inlet to the street. Assume that would have at least some marginal effect on increasing our outflow.
No, it's a volume question, Larry. It's just you need a lot of volume to provide temporary storage, like way more than we can fit in Merwood Park.
Right. So I'm not talking about temporary storage. I'm assuming that these inlets right there especially the ones that are right at Eagle and Wynnefield, not the ones farther down Wynnefield. I get that whole thing will fill up, but the ones that are closer to Eagle that then start their way down toward Caracong Swim Club and toward Caracong Road, to the extent that we can increase capacity on those at all, that gets the water out of there, doesn't it? That gets the water. I mean, that keeps the water from backing up.
Yeah, it does. It does, Larry. And just the idea that, Philly Water Department in Germantown is designing like really large flood tunnels and chambers. Yeah. And it's the scale of thing that really could make a difference is, if you can provide as much volume as possible to store the water and even in the pipes that connect between the inlets, yeah, that gives the water a place to go. Now, again, it's its own set of challenges, putting something like that in the right of way among other utilities. It's an engineering feat, but it could help. I mean, it's what we need to find a lot of volume storage, and it's where are we going to find it? That's what this came down to.
Okay, right, we're right. So, but people face two problems. We face a volume storage issue because the size of a storm that fills Merwood Park is of such a size that there's just no way to handle all that capacity and get it out any faster given our current constrictions with regard to outflow. But for the storm that isn't that bad, but we're still seeing flooding, any kind of incremental increase we can make in outflow, even if it's not 10-foot storm tunnels, but it's going through and replacing inefficient storm drains. And it's running, I don't know, routers and cleaners through the storm drains that currently exist. I assume that could still have some measurable effect, not in the 100-year storm, but in the ones that still cause a headache.
Yeah, the smaller the rainfall amount, the more effective something like that becomes.
And one of our callers brought up the notion of the what I'll call the Merwood Park branch of the creek running 90 degrees into the Wynnefield Drive channel in the back. I've stood in these storms, and probably along with a bunch of other neighbors, risked my life standing in this drive in this backyard because you're just waiting for it to wash away. But is that 90-degree clash of these two storms, does that create backlog into the park? And if we were to dig out a much bigger area, I don't think we can take somebody's property and make a 45-degree angle out of a 90-degree current structure, because that 90-degree current structure is bounded by private property on all sides. But would it still help to make a bigger junction there, a bigger T intersection for it?
If you took out, sorry, if you took out the two 90-degree bends, yes, that would create less of a backwater effect into Merwood Park. And you're right, there's just a lot of hurdles to overcome with property ownership if you were to do something like that, just to try to straighten the creek out just a little bit.
But even if you don't straighten the creek out, my question is, if you think of the wall that the water's hitting, the 90-degree, the water's coming straight out of Merwood Park and smashing right into the far side of the wall.
Okay.
If we dug that wall, I mean, if we got the permission to, we're able to dig that wall out. That's the blue, right? That's the current thing.
Yeah.
So right where it turns there in the channel, if we were able to dig out that channel another 10 feet to the north or the northeast, does that make that combination less violent and create less back flow?
It probably would. It probably make things a little bit less scary out there for something like you described. Yeah, I wouldn't expect it to make a big difference though. It's not really about providing the.
I mean, I don't care, but my experience in seeing this blue, the 90-degree turn farther up in the park, that the floods don't start there. The floods start at on Wynnefield Drive or in the channel behind it, and then start to fill the park, go over the berm, and then everything goes haywire. But so I don't know what we can do about the 90-degree, turn, the first one in Merwood as the water's heading toward Wynnefield Drive. But it seems to me we could certainly investigate the notion of widening its junction with the rest of the creek when it makes that turn in, I guess that what's the 2200 block or the 2300 block of Wynnefield. Or the 2600 block. I forget the numbers. But is that something we should investigate? Is at least widening that junction?
We can talk to some others. I'll go back and speak to some people I work with, and I think it could help. It's how much effort do you want to put into it for what effect? And I'll have to really just get some opinions and get back to you, Larry.
Yeah, and to let Joyce off the hook here, it's not selfish for people on the edges to say, like, is it possible for me to keep the water out of my house? And it doesn't mean you don't care about your neighbors. I mean, all of this is marginal. I mean, all of this is trying to, the 100-year storm is going to screw all of us up. I mean, it lifted the bridge off the road on Caricon Road. It created a landslide above the baseball field down there. The problems that township wide in 100-year or 250-year storm are going to be impossible for us to address. But any marginal help we can make shrinks the impact of folks. And I think the folks who sit at, let's say, ground zero, right down at the bottom of Wynnefield in that 2450 kind of 9 area, those folks have already undertaken a lot of efforts to try to waterproof their homes. But any chance we can get to shrink the footprint of a above average storm, but not the 1 in 1, and not the 1% storm, I think it's certainly worth examining. Certainly worth examining, and seeing what the cost is versus what we know the cost of doing it versus what we've experienced as the cost of experiencing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like I said, let me get back to you, Larry, and get some more on whether this is a worthy endeavor for you guys.
I have a something to say. This is Ann Field. I'm at 2429 Wynnefield Drive. Just would like to see, hearing all of this was really rather discouraging, as I'm sure you realize. And I would feel a lot better if you could say with confidence that you are going to be making this suggestion of some of these incremental changes that we just discussed. That yes, we realize it's not going to prevent us, from having damage if there's a 50-year flood or a 100-year flood. But yes, those incremental changes that could, if you add them all together, potentially make a significant impact, on our lives and our homes, when we're having more than the average, rainfall. It's like, I just want to impress upon you, like, this is obviously, I shouldn't have to say, this is really difficult to deal with. Over and over and over again, I feel like, about the impact that a project like this would have on the rest of the community. But hey, like, what about the people? I think that, we're worth the investment. Like, we have homes here. It seems kind of absurd to me that, it's not, there hasn't been more of a, like, this is what we need to do. Like, yeah, okay, that the first things are not going to prevent damage from a 50-year flood or a 100-year flood, but there's got to be things that we can do. We've talked about a couple of them in the last, 15 minutes. I'm kind of, I want some assurance that you're going to be providing the recognition that these are the things that can be done that will help.
Well, I can give you my word that I'll speak to my colleagues, and this shouldn't come from just one person, but it needs to be a bit of a team effort. I'd like to be able to tell you that all these efforts combined will make a difference, and I don't mean to sound flippant. I don't mean to diminish anyone, the importance of anyone, anybody, anything at all here. But we want to be sure if we say this is going to make an impact, we want to be absolutely sure about it. And, I can't just say here, I can't just give you that tonight, right now. I wish I could, but I can't.
And let me let you off the hook here a little bit. Art and his team will do, they'll undertake any effort that the township directs them to. And Amy and Dave's job is to keep me from spending, $10 million on anything I want to spend money on. But I can assure you, as your commissioner and as the president of the board, that the whole point of this was to figure out what would be effective and what would not be effective. I was somebody who believed that adding a foot acre to Merwood Park would make a difference and make a marginal difference. So this was very informative for me to find out, that some of the grand ideas on property we had complete control over would not work. There still is, frankly, the duty of all of the people who live up and down that flood-prone area to take the individual steps they need to protect their own home, waterproof things, seal off entrances, and do what's necessary. But part of this exercise was to find out what is a useful exercise and what is a useless exercise. And building a retention pond under Merwood Park or dropping it by a foot and creating a couple acre feet of extra areas turned out not to be the problem. Another thing that was investigated for us is what's the problem Karakong is causing to us. We've had that problem answered. So finding the solutions that we can do, including what we just talked about now, does expanding into the area behind Joyce's house help? Does expanding in 90-degree turn into a much larger junction there? Those are things we will look at, and if we can do them, we'll do them. If they're effective, I need the analysis from these guys, whether from these folks, our engineers, about whether they're effective before we can undertake it. But if it can be, like I said, every little bit is important to us, and what happens here important. But it was also important for us to find out what would be not useful. There was a question raised earlier about steps that could be taken farther up the line, and I think this bears repeating. Haverford College a number of years ago undertook a lot of construction work on their campus. In that work, they built, I'm fairly sure I have the numbers right here, a 1 million gallon retention system within their property, which retains water, surface water and rainwater and stormwater during storms, and then trickles it out over a series of days after the event stops. That kind of building for any future development that's up the line from any of our watersheds helps us into the future, because I understand the law now is that you not only have to not create a worse surface water situation, but you actually have to make improvement to it and make it better than the property that you're developing or the property that you're otherwise disturbing. So I hate to say this could have been worse, but some of these storms we suffered in the last 10 years literally could have been worse, but for some of the modern construction and modern laws that have been enacted, and the steps that are then undertaken in these new construction projects, Haverford College being the perfect example, and they are just upstream from us in Ardmore, and it comes down under Haverford Road, and then ends up behind everybody on Wynnefield. So yes, we will undertake whatever we can that may be effective.
Well, I agree with Larry and Art. I just wanted to say that I'm glad I recorded this, because I'm going to have to watch it about 5 or 10 times to try and understand everything you said. And for everybody who's on the call, we'll make it available. And, when we revisit some of these questions with Art in the next week or two, hopefully we'll get some better direction about what the next steps are. And that's all I could say from our perspective at this point. Anybody have any final questions or comments before we log off? Well, I don't see any. So Art, thank you very much. And Tamara, thank you.
Art and Tamara, thank you both. Dave, Amy, neighbors, thank you all for your participation and questions and comments. And we'll be back together soon.
All right. Thank you, Larry.
Thank you very much.
Good night.
Have a good night, everybody.
Thank you. Good night.